Are the effects of slavery more than physical? Does slavery lead to some form of self-hatred? And is that self-hatred then generational or relational? We're going to talk about that and more on this episode of The Urban Perspective. All right, what's up, world? Pastor Jerome here with you for this episode of The Urban Perspective. And I am joined by a professor at St. Augustine's University, also a current PhD student pursuing his doctorate in education. I'm glad to be joined by Colin Adams. Colin, welcome to The Urban Perspective.
Thanks so much for having me, Pastor. Looking
Man,
forward to it.
thank you so much. I'm glad that you are here, man. We got a lot to discuss today, and we're going to get into an interesting topic, and that is kind of the effects of slavery. It's interesting. There are so many different perspectives out about that. Some would say it's something that black and brown people need to simply get over. Some say that's just simply in the past and it doesn't affect our present or our future. How would you respond to those that are of that assertion?
Sure. So it's definitely a topic of interest for many. Um, I think that this is a topic that we have to continue to revisit because clearly these effects that we'll talk about, the existence we'll talk about, we continue to feel even now. Dr. Naeem Akbar, who's a champion of this very topic, wrote an interesting book years ago called Breaking the Chains of Psychological Slavery. And one of the things that he argued was that the process and the system of slavery significantly damaged not just the psychological well-being of those who were enslaved, but also community and family, et cetera, and that those effects continue to reverberate throughout time. So anyone that would argue that this is not something that we need to address, and I hear it even in classroom, I have students that say, listen, I'm not in chains. We're past that. Never saw a plantation. I'm not affected. I think that in itself argues that we need to continue this conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. I read that book. I had a teacher in middle school. I went to Francis Scott Key. Interestingly enough, he's been in the news a lot. The author of the national anthem, where we ignore that third verse. That's something that we shouldn't ignore. But I was a student at Francis Scott Key, and my teacher gave me Dr. Akbar's book, Psychological Slavery. And, reading that in middle school was weird just because, I was surprised that she even gave me the book. But I read it. And he said a lot of things that made sense. Now, he came pretty hard at Christianity in the book. But I think his premise is something that should be built upon, that when you consistently tell someone that they're not valuable, that they're not even human, that they're dehumanized, degraded, and even at some point, at least 3/5 of a person. So we're not even a complete person. Do me a favor. Can you define psychological slavery for us?
Sure. So psychological slavery, mental slavery, it can apply, given the context, it can apply to many different things. So for an example, a person who's kind of stuck in a substance abuse cycle, that's a kind of psychological enslavement. To a person that finds themselves like perpetually in these unhealthy relationships, that could be a form of psychological enslavement. Given the context that we're talking about, psychological enslavement can be looked at in a couple ways. Number one, the social and psychological effects that people of African descent suffered while under bondage, while under enslavement, that mentality, right? The effects continue to get passed down through culture to their offspring, including us. A kind of operationalized way of looking at it, a workable definition of it, is essentially when a person is kind of trapped, right? It's this space, this psychological, mental, emotional space where a person can have difficulty discerning between reality and surreality, right, wrong, information and misinformation, truth, lie, fact, fiction, per se. Um, I think that would be a good way to start to look at that.
Wow. Now,
Mm,
when you the way you unpack that, you basically talked about cycles of destruction, where people keep getting into toxic relationships, or they keep going back to the drug, trying to find something that the drug can never actually produce. When we look at it from a slavery aspect, it seems to be somewhat different because the issue is one of human dignity and human value. Blacks were dehumanized, they were degraded, they were subjugated, they were forced into labor, and then even after that, we would have to, through gradual manumission, if you were lucky, work for freedom. So,
mm.
can you unpack for us how that trajectory can actually lead to self hatred?
Sure, sure. So, um, in in the enslavement, right? So, the mental enslavement.
Mm-hmm.
One of the challenges is navigating what is information and misinformation, right? So, for an example, from the time a person is born, right, they are fed information from world, from culture, from society about themselves and about the world they live in, right? So, for an example, when a child is born, they're fed information about who can be trusted, right? So
Right.
who's meeting my needs, right? Who's feeding me, cleaning me, those kind of things, right? So when we're born, we're fed information, but that does not necessarily mean that all information is good information, right? So when you think of it in the context of slavery or Jim Crow or the civil rights movement, I mean, from the time you're born, names that are less than appreciated, right? Caricatures, false narratives, just a lot of the lies and a lot of the propaganda that, of course, makes the black man, black woman ape-like, unintelligent, promiscuous, dirty, et cetera, et cetera. Well, that's information you're being fed. And in some way, shape, or form, it potentially becomes the way in which you look at yourself, especially when the world around you looks to be the opposite of you.
Mm-hmm. Wow. And so, with that, you kind of alluded to some things like, you're talking about blackface, the way even um, less than 100 years ago, the way we were depicted on TV,
Absolutely.
the way the black woman was depicted. These things can lead to, like, man, am I literally the scum of the earth? Now we got to thank God just for the black family who
Mm,
still instilled value and dignity, so that generations we could eventually get to a civil rights movement and things to
yes.
fight for our value. Now you've unpacked some of that. Can you give us some of the symptoms? What are some of the symptoms of self hatred?
Sure. So when misinformation is provided, um, negative imagery, negative commentary that a person is constantly surrounded with, one of the things that can happen. So of course they begin to look at themselves that way, despise the way that they look, despise who they are, because of course the comparison is, of course, the dominant culture, which embodies all that is beautiful, all that is intelligent, et cetera, et cetera. So they're constantly put in opposition to what they're being fed is everything that is desirable and beautiful and intelligent, and I'm the opposite, right? So that opposition, right, that distance creates a certain level of discontent, negativity towards oneself, um, a kind of irritability and discomfort with oneself and one's culture. An individual that constantly has negative commentary about their culture and about themselves are some very simple examples and symptoms that can be caught every single day.
Well, about a couple years ago, I wrote a blog called "Black but Don't Want to Be," and it was based on an experience I had with another African American brother who was at a predominantly white church, and he had came to an event that we hosted, and he began to share with me how he was extremely critical how he didn't expect the event to go well. Like he came in expecting less of a show, but he was there to see the artists that that we brought to the city. And one of the things I challenged him with, I said, man, you need to repent for not wanting to be black. And he began to cry, and he and me and a brother friends now. He read the blog, so it's not, I'm not bashing him in any way, but I wonder how many brothers and sisters, to transition somewhat, are in situations like that, to where they've associated with the church, the historic black church, with black culture, that we're less than, we're not as good, we're not as intelligent, we're not as astute, we're not as innovative. And when you see those things play out, you mentioned distancing yourself or being extremely critical. How have you seen that play out, or have you seen that play out in ecclesiologically? Have you seen that play out in the church?
Oh, absolutely. So you give a good example. It is the idea that all black churches would ascribe to the prosperity gospel, right?
Mm.
Um, that all black churches shout, speak in tongues, right? These kind of stereotypical descriptions that people use to kind of generalize
Right.
all black church life, right? And that's no issue with using the gifts, but ultimately it's this idea that all churches that are black or majority black do those things, right? It's the idea of a person going to church that is a black church automatically assuming that the pastor is going to hoop, that the pastor is going to
Mm.
take up 5 offerings, a love offering after every verse of the Bible he reads, right? It's this constant stereotypical depiction of the black church based on one or two negative um, interactions with, right? And then when you break that down, you realize that prosperity gospel that didn't begin in the black church, right? That
Look,
has a long history
yeah.
before it hits the black church, right? So again, it's this misinformation constantly, and in all honesty, from a bad experience myself, I had to wrestle through that, and I've shared with you before that. I mean, your discipleship and your counsel really helped me find the joy that I had and the identity that I have that's rooted in the black church, right? And I'm grateful for that because there are so many that still, are wrestling with that.
Yeah, and the thing we're saying for our viewers and listeners out there is, there are tons of black and brown men and women that have had this story, that they've allowed one negative experience to cause them to paint the entire black church with one broad stroke. And then when we view it through that negative lens, you gotta we want you to pause and think about, what are you saying about you, and what are you saying about the Imago Dei? You're made in God's image, and He intentionally wanted you to be the color, the ethnicity that you are. Now, that shouldn't be deified above Christ Himself. So we're not putting ethnocentrism above Christocentrism. However, there's nothing wrong with having an affinity for your people and who God made you to be. And we've seen that. I've seen this play out. Now, I want to go there. This is, I think this is important, because if you're distancing yourself from uh, anything black or brown because you see it as deficient, and you're doing that communally as it relates to the church, what about relationally as it relates to the black woman?
Mm. So here we go.
Let's go there. Let's go
Let's go. Let's
there.
go. Let's
we
go.
we
Let's
go there
go.
on an urban perspective.
So, as an individual who is Team Brown,
Yeah.
I think that is a huge part of it, right? So, part of the misinformation is what is beauty, right?
Yeah.
So, from as young as I can remember, every representation of what is beautiful has always been thin, blonde, and white, right? So from a very early age, I mean, you start to interpret that as, this is the example of beauty, right? Or potentially, this is the example of beauty. When a person is not surrounded with, healthy representation of black beauty, right? Then the alternate, of course, would be what society deems as beautiful. Um, when you're constantly surrounded with that, and then that becomes a part of your psyche, right? A part of the way in which you operate, then it would be no shock and no surprise that you would prefer those who look to be that way, right? So, for an example, one of the things that my wife and I are doing right now, we have twins, boy and a girl. So, we're trying to teach at a very young age that just as you are, right, in the image that God has created you is in fact beautiful regardless of what society looks like, right? So, for example, um, my daughter, she has no white dolls, and now she loves Elsa, she loves Frozen and all of that, and I'll sing Let It Go with her all day. But at the end of the day, no, you're going to be surrounded with healthy representations of beauty, right, that represent you, that you look like, that you can identify with. Um, and I think that my son, in the same way, has to be surrounded with that because through the love of Christ, the walls of hostility are torn down, right?
Yeah,
So ultimately, if that's where he goes, right, if he dates interracially, then I will love him and affirm that. But at the same time, not because black is not beautiful, right? That is unacceptable. So I think for him, he has to be surrounded with healthy imagery of black beauty as well, because I want him to know that, yes, you are beautiful as well. Your sister is beautiful. Your mother's beautiful. Your grandmother's beautiful, right? Black and beautiful. I'm starting to see early signs of that right now because my son, so we're in the mall or we're at church. Well, what's interesting is that if he's approached by multiple individuals, multiple women, we're starting to realize that he responds with excitement to those who are lighter complected.
mm,
Those that are darker complected, he's automatically kind of like standoffish, and in all honesty, because the world in which he lives is constantly surrounded with those who reflect majority culture, his
right.
teachers, administrators, classmates, constantly, right? So we're challenged with surrounding them with beautiful imagery of blackness.
Yeah, it's so great to hear you say that. Affirming black beauty doesn't mean you're anti-white. It doesn't mean you're
Yeah.
anti-marriage. I can speak personally. My daughter has dreads, and I can remember her natural process. And there was a time where she didn't like her hair, and my wife and I just had to intentionally affirm her and say, "Your hair is beautiful. God made you the way that you are." Your hair is beautiful. Your shape is beautiful. Your skin tone is beautiful. This is all the ingenious creation of the creator. And we should
Amen.
celebrate that. And I think it's important, especially as black and brown parents, to be intentional about that level of affirmation because implicitly and explicitly, we're not the standard of beauty. We're in the margins as it relates to American culture and what we see,
Mhm.
and so I just think it's so important to understand that that is a form of self hatred, and
Yeah.
and it's so important because Colin, I don't. It seems to me like people don't see self hatred as sinful. It
Mm.
seems as if we see it as it's subjective, but that it's okay if you want to distance yourself from people that look like you. What would you say to that?
Yeah. So I. So when you think about sin, right, missing the mark, however we want to define sin, I think part of sin is in rebellion, right? So it's what we say about Adam and Eve, right? It's a rebellion against God. Well, I think that self hatred is rebellion just the same, right? It is a kind of rebellion. It's an emotional, right, psychological kind of rebellion against God, as if what He did in making you was not good enough, right? So if I'm not good enough, then the Creator of all things, who is all wise and all knowing, is not good enough. That there's fault even in Him, right? So, and I think that's sin, right? So I distance myself against everyone who looks like me because ultimately what I'm saying is you all are mistakes, right? That
Wow.
God messed up with you, and I think that is sinful.
Yeah, man, that's so good because going back to what we were talking about earlier, I think what is the message that we're sending to black women if we don't see them as viable options because we've
Yeah,
bought into self-hatred? I
yeah,
just think it's important. Like I want to be intentional about because of some of the negative cultural norms we see in our culture. that black men need to be intentional about affirming, encouraging the black woman. Because when you think
Mm.
about it, in one sense, they're a double minority when we in this country. I mean, I know the country.
Female and African American.
Yeah, you know,
Mm.
they're
Mm.
female and they're black, and
Mm.
so there's some unique challenges that come with that of being a double minority in this country, and we have to be intentional about affirming them. Again, we are not anti-interracial marriage, but I think it is a topic that I have not seen broached. That how self-hatred also leads to you viewing women that look like you as not an option. Not just the standard of beauty, but even associating white with more pleasant and more feminine.
Mm. Yeah. And
Um,
can I say one thing? I'm
yeah,
sorry.
yeah, please.
Yeah. So you made me think about something. So one of the things you mentioned earlier was, so the importance of black men, black fathers, affirming black girls, their children, and black women, because lack of course, can affect them as well, which is exactly what you said. So, you know, I'm reminded of the fact that Africa, of all places, right, which is a nation where dark is dominant, right? Um, you go to particular nations in Africa, and you find women that are skin bleaching, right? Even in Africa, right now, not just a not just a Western kind of society like us, but even in Africa, where of course Western society has affected them as well. But I mean, ultimately, where dark is dominant, they still are wrestling with these self-image issues, right?
Yeah,
Here in America, most recently we hear particular celebrities that are skin bleaching. One of which has done it within the past year, who was an incredible woman, but listening to her life story, fathers and boyfriends constantly rejecting her, down talking and making her feel as less than, of course, in favor of those who are lighter than. So, of course, she unrolls and unveils herself, and she's white now, right? Totally white now, blonde. And everyone is shocked. But at the end of the day, her story is what tells what has happened, because her whole life she was told that this is beautiful. So if this is beautiful, then I need to change to become beautiful, right? And I don't think that men constantly see, I don't think that we have a healthy understanding of that, and how our lack of affirmation affects
Mhm.
women psychologically as well.
Well, two-part question, Colin. How one, what is the cure for this, and then two, how can we help those in majority culture not nurture self-hatred in those that may be in their churches because they
Mhm.
may not even be aware that this is even an issue.
Yeah, yeah. So a cure, good question. I think one place to start to um, so ultimately, here's what I'm going to say. I think the ultimate rebuttal, right, to black is not beautiful, right? The ultimate kind of curing process is number one, starting to encourage healthy senses of self, right, and healthy representation of self. So um, again, Akbar is somebody that I've read quite a bit, right? And he says something that makes a lot of sense. And he talks about how part of the process of breaking the chains of psychological enslavement, he says part of the process is in Africanizing our spaces, right? So for me, like in my office right here at school at St. Aug, I've got pictures of people that represent Black culture, right? But behind me, I've got um, a reproduction of a piece of art that Cynthia St. James did. I've got MLK, Malcolm X. I've got W.E.B. Du Bois, Ali, right? Because I want my students to come into this space and feel affirmed, number one, because I mean, it's a misnomer to think just because you're at an HBCU that you have a healthy sense of self. Now, there's loss of self and loss of identity even here too, right? So I want them to come in and be surrounded with representations of them, right? So that's my office, but then now I have to reproduce that at home, right? So it's this idea of surrounding oneself and others with images that represent your culture, right? So that at a very young age, when information is being fed, that you are feeding positive imagery, positive information about what blackness is, and that blackness is beautiful, that blackness is intellectual, that blackness is powerful. At a very second question about how churches, white churches specifically, can not. I think that it goes far beyond singing one song on Sunday, right?
Right.
Don't just sing "Joy" by Vashawn Mitchell today because you want to be diverse, right? I think that, and it goes beyond just hiring, of course, one African American to serve as the token, right? It's in a constant affirmation of blackness, right? A constant affirmation, a constant recognition of the fact that you have members who are of color, right? So, not just inviting them to church, but inviting them to the table, right? Um, Not just choosing a black song to sing with an all-white praise and worship band, right? But bringing them to the table. How can we help you feel comfortable here, right? What are some things that need to be done here, right? Implementing the ideas of people of color, right? Not doing it for them, right? Not doing it for them, but allowing them to help make those decisions. Because ultimately, I think that people of color need to speak for people of color.
Right. That's good. That's good. What what would you what are some books you would suggest for those
Yeah,
that address, psychological slavery, self-hatred, and obviously ultimately how to come out of it?
absolutely. A few good books. One has already been mentioned, and of course, as believers, we got to chew the meat, spit out the bones. But breaking the chains of psychological slavery is an amazing book to read through. Of course, chewing the meat, spitting out the bones. Dr. Akbar converted to Nation of Islam when he was studying at Morehouse back in the 60s, 70s. So he speaks from that context, but it's good information. So that's one I would actually suggest. Another good book by Dr. Joy DeGruy, who teaches in Oregon, is called Post Traumatic Slave Syndrome.
Mm.
That's an amazing book. Some other readings that aren't necessarily books, but psychologists that people could follow. One is a man by the name of Wade Nobles, Dr. Wade Nobles, Stanford educated. Um, he found himself in a space where much like black seminarians, they find themselves in a white space, but not just in a white space, but also in kind of white dominated theology. Dr. Nobles found himself in that kind of space at Stanford, where psychology, as we know it as a discipline, didn't speak to the plight of the black man, right? So Dr. Nobles ends up writing like APA, the American Psychological Association, and saying we need something that affirms us as black people. So they go on to form their own Academy of Black Psychologists.
Wow.
But I would read anything by Wade Nobles. I would read anything by a man by the name of Kobe Cambone, Kobikambon. I believe he's retired now from FAMU, but for you. And then lastly, I would also suggest a brother right here in the Triangle area. His name is Dr. Jonathan Livingston. He teaches at Central. He was a protege of Kobe Cambone at FAMU, went on to get his doctorate at Michigan State, but the brother is phenomenal. So those would be some people I would start with.
That's great. Well, Colin, thanks a lot for tackling these topics and giving us the information, man. Are any final words that you would say to those that will check this out?
Sure. So grateful to you. Thank you so much for inviting me. Um, Really, the only thing I would suggest is that get into that reading, right? Read some of the requested material. Um, Challenge yourself, right? Challenge your own personal perspectives. I think that's where it begins. Where are some of your blind spots, right? Identify some of those, challenge those.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that if there's anyone listening to this right now that may fall into this category of self-hatred, or even in some of the early processes or stages of that, begin to challenge those concepts right now, right? Because all information can be misinformation.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you so much. And just to echo what you said, that we need to challenge this unapologetically and realize
Mhm.
that confrontation is a form of love. And when we see self hatred nurtured by those that are actually ignorant of the black plight and the black experience and black history, then they should probably be silent and put themselves in the position of students rather than teachers to listen to what we're saying. And then lastly, obviously the gospel is the answer, but the gospel is not nebulous. It is a message of justice to oppressed people who are oppressed spiritually, but also in many cases who are oppressed physically. And I think the gospel would give us that renewal, that affirmation. That's the ultimate affirmation we need. But then practically, we need voices like yours and like myself and other men and women out there to talk about these topics. So, Colin, thank you so much. You've been
Thank you.
tuned in to the Urban Perspective. We love you. God bless you. Peace.